Thank you all, thank you both for this very warm welcome and very kind remarks, and I'm looking forward to attending a few more of your um, narratives on contemporary India, and I'm glad to be back at the RGI CS. I once spent a few months here, actually a month or two here, drafting a paper on the issue of migration. Many years ago when Mr. Abid Hussain was here. And it's always good to have perceptions which are in a way critical of dominant discourses, and also critical of ourselves and where we've gone wrong in the past, or where we may have not actually shall we say, traverse the road in a straight and clear manner. When Nikhil met me the other day at the screening of our film on Mizoram, it's called Ramboy, and suggested I come and talk to some of you about some of my ideas and maybe the work I'm doing. I liked the idea because I thought it will be a good chance to interact and listen to your views as well. As many of you will know, I am no longer at Jamia. I launched that Center for Northeast Studies. I was its founder and first director, but 3 months ago I took up an assignment as the director of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, CHRI, which works on right to information, on issues related to prison reform and police reform. Quite a way away from the work that I've been doing, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to bring some of the issues before the region into a larger, shall we say, scope, and take the opportunity to learn more from my young colleagues. So it's taken me about 3 months to get the hang of it, but I'm enjoying it, and it's interesting, challenging, and I would welcome you to our events, and I hope that you will visit us and we have these conversations. But today, since I continue to work on the Northeast and I write about it and read about it and work on it, I thought I would just look at 4 issues relating to the region before we go to the film. And I'll try and sketch these in about 15 to 20 minutes. I have a few notes, so sometimes I will refer to them. The first is, since many of you are familiar with the region, I'm not going to talk about the basics. I'm going to talk about a few issues which are of interest. For instance, many of us are under the impression, those of us who read and write, and the media as well as scholars and others, contemporary thinkers, that the Northeast is a very egalitarian society, that people are largely equal. We don't have dowry, we don't have some of the horrendous crimes that take place in other parts of India. That's what we are told. But I think it will be interesting to take a second look at that. For instance, 2 months ago, November, the Nagaland government took a historic decision. It actually had reversed a historic decision, then it went back to it, which was that women were given the right to contest and participate in municipal elections. Not the right to vote. They were given the right to 33% of reservations. Now you may think that's not a big deal, it's everywhere in India, but in Nagaland, when this was tried, there was very strong opposition from all the political parties, and certainly from the so-called civil society groups, one prominent among them being something called the Naga Ho-Ho. In fact, today one of my friends who's with the Naga Mothers Association sent me this message on WhatsApp, which talks about even today what the situation. Hoki Sema, the president of the Central Naga Tribal Council, which demands abolition of the provision of reservation of seats for women in the civic fold, said, in Naga society, a woman is not considered to be equal to men. She is not even allowed to speak in panchayat until and unless she is summoned by it. Providing 33% reservation to women amounts to giving her the same status of men, and it gives men inferiority complex. Does that sound like equitable society? He also said that the Naga society has been following customary laws for more than 1,000 years, and those just cannot be wiped out. Now, what's really interesting to me is that this is the state, the area where the idea of India, which you spoke about, was first challenged by armed conflict. You know, it wasn't a very easy task for them. They took up arms and they said, we are not Indians, we are never part of you, our story is different. In 3 sentences, that's the Naga story, and which they've maintained up to now, even in the negotiations. And I'll come to that later. So today, we have a situation where the women are demanding their constitutional rights. They've gone to the Supreme Court demanding their rights. Now that tells you a very amazing story, that the area where the first shots against the idea of India were fired, one segment of society has embraced the constitution to ensure that their rights are met. It's a rather complicated way of saying that you're Indian, but it is a significant way of asserting your rights as a citizen and as an individual, as a woman. And you're confronted with this mindset, which is extremely, shall we say, regressive. So this is something I wanted to share with you, because I'm going to link up the last story with the question of rights and equity and the opportunities which exist. Now the second thing that I wanted to share with you was, let me just see, I've got the things in order. Is related to the question of what has been talked about very often is the Indo-Naga Framework Agreement, or the Framework Agreement of August 3, 2015. It's going to be 2 years on August 3. And the agreement that was signed between the Government of India in the Prime Minister's residence and the NSC and IM is still today not a public document. We do not know, as of now, what has been signed officially, or what is the progress after it's been signed in actually coming to a conclusion or a resolution of the conflict or the negotiations between the two sides. The negotiations are largely, as we know, between the IM and the Government of India. It really doesn't matter which government it is. It has been this way for nearly 20 years. In fact, it's going to be 20 years of the negotiations this year, if I recall correctly. And it was a meeting in Paris between Narasimha Rao and the two leaders of the NSCN, a 15-minute meeting in his last year of prime ministership, when this actually opened up the opportunity for a political negotiations, if not a political settlement. So we have this strange, shall we say, dichotomy. You have on the one side, you have a group which is demanding their constitutional rights and are prepared to go to court. You have a traditional process which is resisting that, and you have a constitutional process which is actually not going anywhere, because we don't know what is being discussed. We also don't know the progress, if at all, in these conversations. The Naga Accord with the Government of India is really 3 points. I haven't seen the accord, but I understand that it is really built around 3 points. And the bottom line is basically both sides agree to understand that they have really major issues and there are many complications both in the Government of India side and the NSCN side. So it's an agreement to talk further, but those talks are already taking place. So that's why I think it's becoming very difficult for the government to come out and say this is the framework agreement, when there actually isn't an agreement. There's just a framework which existed even before the framework was established. So that's the second thing I wanted to say, that I think it's very important that such things as in the 1976 Accord or even 64, when there's a history of negotiation with the Naga leadership which goes back more than 50 years, that there should be openness, transparency, and an importance given to civil society and the voices that speak for that represent people's interests. This has not happened so far. It's been limited and kept to a small group, and many people in Nagaland, whether it's the women's groups or other groups, have been expressing deep concern about the fact that today the NSCN leadership is really one leader, and he doesn't take part in all the discussions anymore. The other, his compatriot of 50 years, Isaac Su, has passed on last year and was really not physically well enough to take part in the negotiations for some time before that. So people are asking, where is this going to go? How will we move forward? Will we have peace? Because the younger generation, I see some younger people from the region there, are interested in other issues. They're looking at a future, if not within India, even outside of India, as in their personal capacity, in their professional capacity, seeking to build a life for themselves and for their communities. And that's the third thing I want to come to. We all know that the Northeast has 8 states, right? 8 states. We actually have a 9th, which is this city. This is the 9th state of the Northeast, because thousands of people are migrating every year to live, work, study, and find a future for themselves in Delhi or the NCR. They don't necessarily work in great institutions. They may not get great grades in the places that they study, but they've made a conscious choice to leave and to seek a future in the metros of India or in other parts of India. And for the first time in its history over the past years, the region that we call the Northeast, I find it difficult to call it that, because for this very simple reason that the Northeast became a formal part of the Indian government's lexicon in 1971, when the reorganization of Assam and the northeastern states took place. Before that, there was no such thing. So For the first time in its history, this region has become a migrant producing area. It has been traditionally and historically a migrant receiving area. So we have, nobody knows for sure the exact figures. We have several lakh people from the region who live, work and study in Delhi and the neighborhood, and several times that figure in other parts of the country. For instance, if you recall, in 2012, there were these extremely terrible riots in Assam, in which many Muslims were targeted. About 4.5 lakh people were displaced. It was largely a clash between the Boros and Muslims of Bengali origin in Assam, in western Assam. But something like about 100 got killed, but over 4 lakh people were displaced. It is the single biggest displacement in India, internal displacement post-partition in a conflict. And you will remember that in places like Karnataka and the then composite state of Andhra Pradesh, many people got onto trains, and there were photographs of them crowding the railway stations and going back. What people tend to do to forget, the media, given its style, of course focused on these things as it should. And they said that something like 30,000 people from the region had gone back to their homes, largely to Assam, and then dispersed to other states. What they did not say that was 1/10 of the population of people from the region in the state. So 10% left, 90% stayed, but 90% staying wasn't a story. 10% leaving was. So I think the issues are much more compelling and much more interesting and much more, shall we say, nuanced than we can ever begin to understand. Certainly it's beyond my ken to understand these things. But I try and put these ideas together in things that I write for the popular media, as well as longer essays, and for the book that I've just finished on the Northeast, which hopefully should be out in September or so. So, and the migration issue is something that I have followed for many years, not just the out-migration from the northeastern states into cities like Delhi and Bombay and places like Goa and Karnataka, but also the in-migration from other countries and other parts of India into the region. What the present dispensation calls Bangladeshis, or that word has been used very extensively in Assam and the Northeast for a long period of time. So I think that this is something that we need to look at in a much more focused and rational way. Rationality is not necessarily the first thing that people think about, or how they approach an issue like this, but since I worked on this issue for about 25 or 30 years, I will walk you very briefly through it, because first of all, we need to address those who speak about millions and millions or tens of millions of Bangladeshis by presenting a very simple fact. A Bangladeshi is somebody who's come from Bangladesh. He is not somebody who came when Bangladesh was not there. That's East Pakistan. And the Bangladeshis, the governments of Bangladesh and the people of Bangladesh, certainly the scholars, the intellectuals, the professionals, people in the army, etc., have no commitment to what East Pakistan did in the years that it was in control, or Pakistan did that it was in control of what is today's Bangladesh. So I think that's a very important fact that people don't seem to realize, and this is a point, a very simple point that I keep pressing, and that everybody who is of Bengali origin and happens to be Muslim is not necessarily a Bangladeshi. I am not saying that there is no migration. There is migration. There has been extensive migration in the millions from Bangladesh. Even the Bangladeshi scholars who worked on it, and you need to look at the work of in the Bangladeshi Institute of Developing Studies, where they speak of out-migration in the region of 3.4 million between 1970 and 75. And that was for two reasons. The migration not just of people who left because of the crackdown during the liberation struggle or the lead up to the creation of Bangladesh and the war of 71. But this is also people who fled post. There was a terrible famine in Bangladesh which killed hundreds of thousands of people, which people don't recognize. We had the Great Bengal famine, which provoked Amartya Sen to develop his, not just his thesis, but his entire Nobel Prize winning work in philosophy. But there were, I believe, hundreds of thousands of Bangladeshis who died in 1974, 73, 74, in a terrible famine. And the reports, the accounts from eyewitnesses who tell me is that bodies were lying at the railway stations. You know, people had to walk their way over the bodies or by them. But the other day I was making a presentation to some very senior people in government, not the political leadership, but in the official leadership, the bureaucracy. And I said that if you hear a figure like 10 million, let's do a back of the envelope calculation. You divide the number of people you say who have come here by the number of days, and say that you will have nearly 1,000 people crossing the border every day for 40 years. Now, is that actually possible? Does that happen? People don't migrate just like that. They're not that organized. Now they're getting a bit more organized both within and outside the country. So I put it at that. I'm not going to leave it there. I'll pick up one more point from there, and then I'll go to the last part of my presentation, which is connected to the first. Nobody really knows how many migrants there are, certainly in Assam and the Northeast. We assume that because people are Muslims of Bengali descent, that many of them are Bangladeshis. It's not so. I recently went back to Nellie. Many of you know what Nellie is, what it represents in the history of Assam, in contemporary Assam. For those who don't, who hasn't heard of Nellie? Everybody's heard of Nellie. Everybody knows about it. Okay. 1,753 people were killed in the space of 4 to 6 hours. I was there a day after the killings as a reporter for the New York Times. And in one particular paddy field, I counted 200 bodies. I had an altercation with Mrs. Indira Gandhi, very sharp one, because I happened to be the only journalist who was, there's this security loop which is tied around journalists. I happened to be out of the loop. It also helped that my uncle was a Director General of Police. But anyway, that's beside the point. So here I am, and here's Mrs. Gandhi. And, I'd met her a few times before. She didn't really know me. And I asked her the questions that any journalist would ask. Do you take responsibility for this? How many people died here? What is your assessment? What's going to happen? And she was getting quite exasperated at the end of it. Then she said, these are all exaggerations. I said, Prime Minister, I counted 200 bodies yesterday, okay, in this one patch, where you are. And they've cleared it up because you've come by helicopter from Delhi, or Guwahati. But those people have been there since 1938. That is their position. They moved from another part of Assam to come there. A lot of the migrations have taken place over a period of time. Now, the new migrations which have come post 71 are substantial. They're not small. But at the same time, I don't think we should be in a situation where we are targeting or discriminating against people for the very simple reason that this can lead to extremely bad situations, conflicts, etc. because we need to be clear who is being approached, who is being targeted. Are they being targeted because of their religion, their language, or what? You need to be clear that this has to be a legal process. You cannot have a process that is not legal and that is not acceptable because it's not legal. And where some people feel they're being discriminated against on the basis of religion or whatever. Which brings me actually to the last two, not one, last 2 points. I've just come back from Myanmar. And what I heard there was very disturbing about the condition in the country, where people are very unhappy with what is the current government of Aung San Suu Kyi, feeling that things are not going the way they had hoped they would go, that essentially the government is not delivering, and she is a great communicator, but for the last 8 months she has not had a single public broadcast to the nation. She doesn't communicate to many people, and there is a small group of people around her who advise her or who she turns to. To the point that it is international specialists who are advising the government of Myanmar on what kind of economic policies they should follow. There are virtually no Myanmarese or Burmese economists in the picture, which is not a good thing. But that's not what I'm speaking about. The economy is going through the floor, down the tube. But what is very of great concern now, and certainly in Myanmar it is becoming to be more of a concern than before, is the issue with the Rohingyas. Because for the first time in so many years, there is actually a force within the Rohingya movement. Should I explain the Rohingya issue? Or most people are familiar with it. You're familiar with the facts that in November and December there were these 2 major attacks on a police station in the Arakan, which killed an entire police unit, or at least disarmed them and killed a number of them. And the attackers walked off with the entire armory. And they also ambushed a military convoy and killed a major and injured several other officers and soldiers in that attack. It was a very well organized attack, both of them. Both of the attacks were well organized. And what I came to know through my conversations in Yangon is that for the first time, quite apart from the RSO and so on, there is now a group in the Arakan, in the Rohingya area, who have deep roots in Saudi Arabia. These are people of Rohingya origin whose families came over and live with or live in, they have studied in and worked in Saudi Arabia. Over the past year, they've seen combat in Central Asia and in the Middle East. And some of these groups, these individuals, have actually gone back to the Arakan to organize this movement. And when these attacks took place and the Myanmar government reacted as it has over the past 30 years with a very sharp military drive aimed at the Muslim Rohingya population, as a result of which about 300,000 are living in refugee camps in Bangladesh, in the Chittagong area. Several Saudi, I believe, organizations have suddenly taken notice of this. And I understand are coming forward to offer support to this particular group, whose leader is a man, I think, if I'm Ahmedullah, I'm not quite sure, but I'll get that name in a bit. one report I had is that some 500 to 600 people have been trained in the Arakan in armed warfare, in guerrilla warfare. Now you link that, when I heard about this, you link that to what's happening in Bangladesh, which is a radicalization among younger people, but among younger people who are middle class and even affluent. It's not just one group. It's not just the poor. It is the middle class and the affluent who are being radicalized. You connect that to what's happening in Assam. I'm not saying that people are getting radicalized, but if pressure continues to bear on them, if you push people to the wall, if they feel that they do not have an honorable space as citizens, you undermine their dignity, you harm their integrity, and you question their nationalism or patriotism or whatever, just on the basis of a suspicion that they are not from here, when they may have been around for 100 years or 50 years or whatever, then you're really laying the ground for the circle of unreason to connect. And once that happens, I don't think there will be many security forces. Certainly in Myanmar, they're completely unprepared for anything like this. In this country, at least there is some depth in the apparatus. It may not be great, but there is some depth. But if you see a potential link up between these three, that is what really worries me in the next few years. I mean, we do need to think ahead. Everything is not boiling down to security issues and so on, but we would be very, very remiss if we took this out of our own thinking, did not think of this or figure this into our thinking. The last point I'd like to talk about is something that I've done for a number of years, which is unrelated to the last three things, but linked to the first, which is the status of women. And in Assam, I go back to the beginning, where I talked about we describe ourselves as a society where there's a great deal of equality, gender equality, etc., etc. But you look at the stats. What do the statistics tell you? In Nagaland, most women can't inherit property. Okay? That's one thing. I talked about Nagaland at the beginning. But I want to come to Assam. Assam has the worst maternal mortality ratio in India. 10 years ago, it was nearly 500 per lakh of women who were giving birth were dying in childbirth. So I was saying that Assam is the most dangerous place in India to be if you're a woman, a young woman in a rural area about to give birth. Bihar, UP, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, all the so-called Bimaru states have far better indices. Today, we are at 300 or just below. Bihar is already below 200 in terms of MMR. IMR, Assam is the worst in the country, along with Madhya Pradesh. So when we talk about our conditions as whether we are equal or unequal society and compare ourselves, oh, we don't have dowry, you don't have this, okay, you don't have that, but your women are dying. Why are they dying in childbirth? And it's not, an interesting statistic is, they are not just dying in the minority areas. In fact, there the conditions have improved tremendously. The maximum number of deaths, of maternal mortality deaths, are taking place in the richest part of Assam, which is the tea gardens. Among the community which is vulnerable, which is the tea plantation labor. And that's when I think, certainly the Congress party has failed. One of the failures of the Congress party over the last 40, 50 years in Assam has been its total failure to give not just a decent wage, but decent living conditions, to ensure decent living conditions for people who are living in these areas. The hospitals don't work. There are no doctors there. This sounds familiar, but you might like to think about the fact that these are hospitals set up with private funding. Today, it's not the government of Assam or the government of India which is supporting. It is UNICEF. An international organization is supporting the National Health Mission or the tea gardens in giving health care to their workers. I mean, I cannot think of something more traumatic, where an international group has to come in and hold your hand and say that, you know, it's really a, shall we say, a devastating indictment on the state of governance in the state. And it's not just going back a few years, it's going back a long time. And that's where some of us had the thought to intervene. And I'm going to close here with that. It's now about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, 12 years ago, that I had this idea of a ship of hope in a valley of flood, which essentially would take health services to people who needed it. Now, it was a slightly romantic idea, but I sort of broke it down into nuts and bolts, and we developed this boat clinic concept, by which we take health care, the basic health care, to people living on islands. Now, I don't know, all of you are very well-read people, so you would know that Assam has a very large river, the Brahmaputra. What you may not know is that approximately 10% of the population of Assam lives on those, on the islands in the river, and there are 2,500 islands on the river. And most of them don't have access to health care, forget about education. So I saw this as one very specific targeted community that we would approach. Today, we started with one boat in one district. Today, we have 15 boats, boat clinics. We work with the National Health Mission through the Government of India and the state of Assam. And we have reached something like 5 lakh people with health care. In all the areas where we work, the MMR levels have dropped dramatically, and the IMR levels also have, these have improved. And we have 250 people, doctors, nurses, and community workers and others who work on this program. And I think it's a good upscaling program which started under the previous regime, government in Assam, and which is continuing. You know, so I always say that we must have dreams. I mean, all of our dreams may be not be the same, and we may have many dreams. But at least in this one thing, I think whatever I do here, or I did at Jamia, that now we reach people with healthcare that touches their lives, that gives them sustenance, saves them from fatality or certainly from extensive morbidity. I think that is a good thing to have done in one's life.